Hi guys, welcome to your YouTube channel, your big family. In this video, I am going to read you the whole book entitled Who Seed My Cheese. Enjoy your time. Let's go. Who Seed My Cheese? A surprising way to approach changes in your personal and professional life. By Dr. Spencer Johnson. Foreword by Kenneth Blanchard. D. From the co-author of the best-selling The 1-Minute Manager. Translation by Dr. Christopher Fernald DMV, Executive MBA, Expert MBTI. Life is not just any straight corridor in which we travel freely and unhindered, but a labyrinth through which we must find our way, lost and confused, sometimes finding ourselves at an impasse. But still, if we have faith, God will open a door for us. Maybe not the one we thought, but which will eventually turn out to be good for us. A.J. Cronin. Content of the document. The story behind the story, Kenneth Blanchard, Ph.D. to a meeting in Chicago. 4th The History of Cheese. 5 A discussion, a little later, the same day 13. The story behind the story, Kenneth Blanchard, Ph.D. I'm happy to tell you the story behind Qui a piqué mon fromage, because it means that the book is written and that everyone can read it, enjoy it and share it with others. I've been wishing for it ever since I heard Spencer Johnson tell his remarkable story, years before we wrote our The 1-Minute Manager book. I remember thinking how interesting and useful this story was. Who Seed My Cheese? Is a fable about change. It takes place in a maze where 4 amusing characters search for their cheese, cheese being a metaphor for what we want to have, whether that be a job, a relationship, money, a big house, freedom, health, recognition, spiritual peace or even an activity like jogging or golf. Each of us has our own idea of what our cheese represents and we pursue it because we assume it will make us happy. If we get it, we often get attached to it. The labyrinth in this story represents the place where you spend time looking for what you want. It could be the company you work for or the social network you build in your lifetime. I tell his story of the cheese that you are about to read, in my conferences, all over the world, and I often hear about the impact this story has on people's lives. Believe it or not, it has saved lives, marriages and careers. One of the many true examples is that of Charlie Jones, a highly respected radio professional on NBC TV. Had saved his career. His job is unique, but the teaching he drew can be used by anyone. Here's what happened. Charlie had worked hard and done a great job of broadcasting track and field events from previous Olympics. Not knowing these sports so well, he was disappointed. Feeling denigrated, he got angry. He protested. It wasn't fair. His resentment gradually affected all his work. Then he heard the story of Who Stole My Cheese? Made fun of himself and changed his attitude. He understood that his boss had simply moved his cheese and adapted. It wasn't long before his boss recognized his new attitude and energy, and gave him new assignments. He then enjoyed more success than ever and was later inducted into Pro Football's Hall of Fame, Broadcasters Alley. I've seen the impact this story has on people, from their professional life to their love life. I believe so much in the power of Who Stabbed My Cheese? That I recently distributed a copy to the staff of my company, over 200 employees. Why? Because like all companies that want not only to survive, but also to stay competitive, Blanchard training and development is constantly evolving. Our cheese is constantly on the move. While in the past we were looking for loyal employees, today we need flexible people who can change their habits. And yet, as you know, constantly living in whitewater at work or in life can be stressful unless you perceive the changes in a way that you understand them. When my CO workers started reading Qui a piqué mon fromage, you can almost smell the negative energy being released. Believe me, reading this short parable takes little time, but its impact can be decisive. You will find 3 chapters. In the first, a meeting in Chicago, former classmates discuss during a reunion about how they manage the changes occurring in their lives, is the heart of the book. In the third section, a discussion, a little later on the same day, the classmates discuss what the story means to them and how they will use it in their work and in their lives. Some employees in my company preferred to stop at the end of the story, without reading part 3, and interpret its meaning for themselves. Others enjoyed reading a discussion because it stimulated their thinking about how they might apply this teaching to their own situation. In any case, like me, I hope that each time you read Qui a piqué mon fromage, you will find something new and useful, that it will help you cope with the changes and ensure your success. However your definition of success. I hope you enjoy what you discover and I send you my best wishes. Don't forget, travel with a cheese. Ken Blanchard, San Diego, 1998. A meeting in Chicago. One Sunday, under the Chicago sun, former classmates gather for lunch, following their prom night the previous night. They want to learn more about their respective lives. After a good laugh and a good meal, they strike up an interesting conversation. Angela, one of the most popular people in her class, begins. Sure, my life took a different turn than I imagined when we were at school. A lot of things have changed. No doubt, echoes Nathan. He joined the family business, which has always operated more or less in the same way and has been part of the local ecosystem as far back as his comrades can remember. Asking for. But, have you noticed how we don't want to change when things change? I suppose, said Carlos, that we resist change because we are afraid of it. Carlos, you were the captain of the football team, Jessica is surprised. I never thought I'd hear one day that you were scared. All of them realized that, despite having gone in different directions, from work, to home or to running businesses, they have similar feelings. In recent years they have been trying to cope with unexpected changes and for the most part admit they don't know how to deal with it. So Michael says, before, I was afraid of it. When a big change happened in our company, we didn't know what to do. So we didn't evolve and we lost almost everything. And so, he continues, until I heard a funny little story that changed everything. How? Nathan asked. Well, this story upset my perception of the change and after that, my situation quickly improved, at work and in my life. Then I told the story to some colleagues who he told others, and our business quickly prospered because we all adapted to keep up with the change. And like me, the story helped a lot in their personal lives. What is this story? Asked Angela. She is called Qui a piqué mon cheese? The group burst out laughing. I already love her, Carlos enthuses. Can you tell us? Of course, answers Michael. I would be happy, it is not long. And he begins. A history of cheese. Once upon a time, a long time ago in a faraway land, there lived 4 little characters who ran through a maze in search of cheese to feed themselves and make them happy. 2 of them were mice named Sniff and Woof, and 2 were dwarfs, Hum and Ha. Due to the small size of these characters, it was easy to distinguish what they were doing. But if you looked closely enough, you could discover a most amazing activity. Every day, mice and dwarfs spent their time in the labyrinth looking for their own cheese. The mice, Sniff and Woof, had simple rodent brains, but also good instincts. They were looking for hard cheese that they liked to nibble on, as they often do for mice. The dwarves, Hum and Ha, used their minds full of multiple beliefs, to search for their very particular cheese, with a capital F, which, according to their conviction, would fill them with happiness and success. As different as mice and dwarfs were, they had something in common. Every morning they would put on their joggers and running shoes, leave their homes, and rush through the maze in search of their favorite cheese. The maze was a maze of corridors and rooms. Some contained the delicious cheese. But there were also nooks and crannies. Getting lost was easy. However, if they found their way, the labyrinth held secrets that offered them a better life. The mice, Sniff and Woof, used the simple but effective method of trial and error. They ran down a hallway. If it turned out to be empty, Sniff and Voof would turn around and hurry to another. Sniff, using his flair, smelled approximately where the smell of cheese was coming from and Voof rushed in. As you suspect, he got lost, went in the wrong direction, often falling on walls. The Hum and Ha dwarves, on the other hand, used a different method. They relied on their ability to think and learn from their past experiences, although sometimes they were guided by their certainties and their emotions. Finally, one day, everyone discovered what they were looking for, their own cheese, at the end of one of the corridors at Station Fromage. On the following mornings, mice and dwarfs dressed while wearing doors and headed for Cheese Station C. It wasn't long before everyone fell into a routine. Sniff and Voof continued to wake up early and rushed through the maze, always following the same route. When they arrived, the mice took off their running shoes, tied them together, and hung them around their elbows so they could quickly grab hold of them when needed. Then they savored the cheese. At first, Hum and Ha also flocked to Cheese Station C to enjoy the new and tasty morsels that awaited them. But after a while, a different routine takes hold among the dwarves. Hum and Ha woke up a little later each day, dressed a little slower, and walked to Cheese Station C. After all, they knew where the cheese was now and how to get there. They didn't know the source, or who placed it there. They hung up their jogging clothes, put away their running shoes and put on their slippers. "It's fantastic," said Hum. "Here, there's enough cheese for a lifetime." The dwarfs felt happy and triumphant. They felt safe. Quickly, Hum and Ha considered the cheese from Cheese Station C as their cheese. It was such a deposit that they ended up moving to be closer to it and create a new social life. To make them feel more at home, Hum and Ha decorated the walls with quotes and even drew cheese around them, which made them smile. From time to time, Hum and Ha would invite their friends over to see their pile of cheese from Cheese Station, and proudly show it to them, saying, "Has Malsa cheese, huh?" Sometimes they shared it. Sometimes they didn't. "We deserve this cheese," asserted Hum. "We worked long and hard to find it." He picked up a nice piece of strawberry and ate it. Afterwards, he often fell asleep. Waddled home, sated. Every morning, they were confident that they would finally be able to come home during the day. This lasted for quite a while. Then Hum and Ha's confidence turned to arrogance. Soon, they didn't even notice what was happening. Meanwhile, Sniff and Voof went on with their routine. They arrived early, sniffed, scratched and rushed to Cheese Station C, inspecting the area to assess any progress since the day before. Then they sat down to nibble on the cheese. One morning, they arrived at Cheese Station C and discovered that there was no more cheese. They weren't surprised. Sniff and Voof had noticed that the supply was dwindling every day. They were prepared for the inevitable and instinctively knew what to do. They looked at him, untied their running shoes mischievously tied and hung around his neck, pulled him to his paws and lacerated him. The mice didn't overanalyze the situation. They weren't burdened with many complex beliefs. To them, the problem and the answer seemed simple. The situation at the cheese station had changed. So Sniff and Voof had decided to change. They looked at the maze. Sniffed at Ruffle, sniffled, then nodded to Voof, who rushed through the maze while Sniff followed as quickly as possible. Quickly, they found themselves very far away, looking for new cheese. Later that same day, Hum and Ha arrived at Cheese Station C. They hadn't noticed the little changes that had happened the previous days. They took the existence of their cheese for granted and were unprepared for what they saw. "What? No cheese?" Hum cried. "No cheese? No cheese?" As if he shouted loud enough, someone would put him back. "Hoseed me keys?" Finally, he put his hands on his hips, his face flushed, and cried as loud as he could. "It is not fair." Ha, in disbelief, just shook his head. He too thought he found the cheese. Shocked, he stood still. He was just not prepared for this. Hum was screaming, But Ha wasn't listening. He didn't want to deal with the problem, so he refused to trade. The behavior of the dwarves was neither interesting nor productive. House could understand that given the difficulty in finding cheese, which meant much more than having enough to eat each day. For some, finding cheese means possessing material things. For others, it means feeling healthy, developing a spiritual sense of well-being. For Ha, the cheese simply meant feeling safe, having a loving family one day and living in a comfortable house on Cheddar Street. For Hum, the cheese was huge. It was like owning a big house at the top of Camembert Hill. Because cheese was so important to them, the two dwarves spent a lot of time deciding what to do. They were looking around station without cheese to see if the cheese had really disappeared. While Sniff and Voof moved quickly, Hum and Ha continued to make Hum and Ha. They raged and cried foul. Ha sank into depression. What would happen if the cheese hadn't come back the next day? He had built projects by capitalizing on that cheese. The dwarves didn't believe it. How could this have happened? No one warned them. It wasn't fair. Things weren't supposed to turn out this way. Hum and Ha went home that evening, hungry and discouraged. But before they left, Ha wrote on the wall, "The more important your cheese is to you, the more you cling to it." The next day, Hum and Ha left their house and went back to Cheese Station C, where they thought they'd find some cheese. But the situation hadn't changed. The cheese wasn't there anymore. The dwarfs felt helpless. They stood there, motionless like two statues. Ha closed his eyes and put his hands over his ears. He wanted to block everything. He didn't want to admit that the supply of cheese had gradually dwindled. He was convinced that the mug had moved suddenly. Hum analyzed the situation again and again, and finally his brain was complicated and full of a huge belief system. Concluded. "Why didn't they do this to me?" he asked. "What is really going on here?" Opened his eyes, looked around him and said, "By the way, where are Sniff and Voof? Do you think they know something that we don't?" "What could they know?" said Hum, mockingly. "They're simple mice. They just react to what's happening. We're dwarves. We're special. We should be able to understand that. Besides, we deserve better. This shouldn't happen to us, or at least we should get some benefits." "Why should we be favored?" asked Ha. "Because it is our right," declared Hum. "Our right?" wanted to know Hum. "We are entitled to our cheese." "Why?" asked Ha. "Because we are not responsible for this problem," says Hum. "Someone else is and get us compensation." "Maybe we should stop analyzing the situation so much and go find some new cheese," Ha suggested. "Oh no," maintained Hum. "I want to carry this reflection to the end." While Hum and Ha were still hesitating, Sniff and Voof were on the road. They thought of nothing but finding new cheese. Empty-handed for a moment, they went to a hitherto unexplored area of the maze, Cheese Station, and ecstatic, they began to scream. They had found what they were looking for, a large supply of new cheese. They could hardly believe their eyes. It was the biggest heap of cheese they had ever seen. Meanwhile, Hum and Ha Cheese Station C were assessing their situation. They were suffering from the effects of fasting. Frustration and anger were mounting. They blamed each other for this situation. From then on, Ha started thinking about the mice, Sniff and Voof, and wondered if they had found any new cheese. He thought they had had a hard time, knowing the uncertainties of this race through the labyrinth. Sometimes Ha pictured Sniff and Voof finding new cheese and savoring it. He thought how much he would enjoy going back to the adventure in the maze and finding fresh new cheese. He dreamed about his taste. The more he imagined finding new cheese and enjoying it, the more he saw himself leaving Cheese Station C. "Let's go," he exclaimed, suddenly. "No," replied Hum. "I like this place. It's comfortable. That's what I know. Besides, it's dangerous outside." "Not at all," Ha said. "I'm too old for that," Hum said. and I don't want to lose myself and make a fool of myself. Aren't you? Then the fear of failure returned to Ha's mind and the hope of finding new cheese vanished. So every day the dwarves did the same. They went to cheese station C, found no cheese, and went home, taking their worries and frustrations away. They denied what was happening, but had more trouble getting to sleep, less energy the next day, and became irritable. Their homes were no longer the comforting place of old. The dwarfs slept badly and nightmared at the thought of more cheese. But Hum and Ha went back again and again to the cheese station and waited there all day. Hummed it. You know, maybe if we work harder, we'll find that nothing has really changed. The cheese must be nearby. Maybe they just hid it behind the wall. The next day, Hum and Ha gathered tools. Hum held the chisel while Ha banged on the hammer until he gouged a hole in the wall of cheese station C. They looked through it but found nothing. They were disappointed, but thought that would solve the problem. So they started earlier, stayed later, and worked harder. But after a while, all they got was a big hole in the wall. Ha was beginning to understand the difference between activity and productivity. Maybe, said Hum, we should sit here and see what happens. Sooner or later, they'll put the cheese back. Ha wanted to believe it. So every day, he would come home to rest and would reluctantly return with Hum to cheese station C, but the cheese never reappeared. Now hunger and stress were weakening the dwarves. Ha was tired of waiting for their situation to improve. He began to think that the longer they went without cheese, the worse they would get out of it. He knew they were being left behind. Finally, one day, Ha ends up laughing at himself. Ha, look at me. I'm doing the same things over and over and I wonder why nothing is improving. If it wasn't so ridiculous, it would be even more hilarious. Ha didn't like the idea of having to run through the maze again, because he knew he could get lost and had no idea where to find cheese. He asked Hum, "Where did we put our tracksuits and jogging shoes?" It took them a long time to find them. They had put them aside when they arrived at cheese station C, because they didn't think they needed them anymore. Seeing his friend getting dressed, Hum said, "You're not planning to go back to this labyrinth, are you? Why don't you just wait here for the cheese to come back?" "Because he won't come back," said Ha. "I didn't want to see him either, but now I realize that the old cheese won't be given back. That's yesterday's cheese. It's time to find the new cheese." "But what will happen if there is no cheese outside?" argued Hum. "Or even if there is, and that one can find it?" "I don't know," said Ha. He had questioned himself too many times and again felt paralyzed by fear. Then he thought about finding some cheese and all the good things that came with it and mustered up his courage. "Sometimes," said Ha, "things change definitively. That's the case today, Hum. That's life." And she continues. "And we too. We must continue." Ha looked at his emaciated companion and gave him arguments that made sense to him. But Hum's fears had turned to anger and he wasn't listening. Ha didn't mean to be rude to his friend, but he laughed when he saw their foolishness. As he prepared, Ha began to feel more alive. He could finally laugh at himself. "Let go and move on," they exclaimed. "It's time for the labyrinth." Hum Narratnine answered. Ha picked up a small sharp stone and wrote a thought on the wall for Hum to ponder. As usual, Ha even drew a piece of cheese around it, hoping it would make Hum smile and motivate him to go get some new cheese. But Hum didn't want to see it. The inscription said, "If you don't change, you can disappear." Then Ha popped his head out and anxiously stared into the maze. He thought back to how he'd ended up without cheese. He had believed that there was no more cheese in the labyrinth, or that he would not find it. These fearful beliefs petrified and crushed him. Ha smiled. He knew Hum was wondering who had nicked his cheese, but he was wondering why he hadn't moved his cheese sooner. Having started to wander through the maze, Ha looked back and felt his comfort zone. Anxiety mounted. He wondered if he really wanted to go into the labyrinth. He wrote a sentence on the wall opposite and considered it for a moment. What would you do if you weren't afraid? He was meditating. He knew that sometimes fear is good because the degrading thing does not react and fear can incite action. However, it is not beneficial in excess because it inhibits movement. He looked to his right, towards an unexplored part of the labyrinth and felt this fear. Then he took a deep breath, turned right and ran slowly, towards the unknown. As he was trying to find his way, Ra was worried that he might have waited too long at Cheese Station C. Long fasting had made him weak. The more strenuous journey through the maze was also taking him longer. He decided that if that happened again, he would adapt to the change sooner to make things easier. Then, Ra smiled slightly as he thought, better late than never. Over the next few days, Ra found some cheese around there, but nothing very durable. He hoped to find enough cheese to take back to him and encourage him to come out into the maze. But he lacked confidence and admitted that the labyrinth troubled him. Things seemed to have changed since the last time. Just when he thought he was going to get out, he got lost in the corridors. He took 2 steps forward, 1 step back. Although it was a challenge, he admitted that getting back into the maze and looking for cheese wasn't as bad as he had feared. Gradually, he began to wonder if it was realistic to count on new cheese. Didn't he only have eyes bigger than his belly? Then he laughed, realizing that he didn't have anything to eat at the moment anyway. At each moment of discouragement, he remembered that however unpleasant his current activity was, it was no worse than staying without cheese. He took control of the situation rather than suffer it. After all, if Sniffetwoof could move forward, then so could Sniffet. Later, looking back, I realized that the cheese at Cheese Station C had not disappeared overnight, as he had originally thought. Towards the end, the amount of cheese had decreased and what remained had aged. The mold had even grown although he hadn't noticed anything. Still, he had to admit that if he had wanted to, he could probably have foreseen what was coming. But he hadn't seen anything. Ha now realized that the change probably wouldn't have surprised him if he had been watching what was happening as he went along and anticipating the change. Maybe that's what Sniffetwoof had done. He stopped to rest and wrote on the labyrinth wall. Sniff the cheese often to know when it is getting old. Sometime later, Ha finally stumbled upon a gigantic cheese station that was initially promising. However, on entering, he was disappointed to have empty. This feeling of emptiness assails me too often, he says. He wanted to give up. Ra was losing his physical strength. He had lost himself and was afraid of not surviving. He was afraid more often than he admitted. He didn't know exactly what frightened him, but in his weak state the loneliness weighed on him. Without being fully aware of it, he was held back, weighed down by beliefs, and beset by fear. Ra wondered if Hum had moved or if he was still paralyzed by his fears. Then Ha remembered that he felt very well in the maze when he walked. He wrote on the wall, as much to remind himself as to mark the way for his friend Hum who might follow him. Moving in a new direction helps you find new cheese. Ha looked down the dark hallway. He was aware of the fear. What was it? Was it empty? Sigh again. Were there any hidden dangers? He began to imagine all the frightening things that could happen to him. Then he laughed to himself. He realized that his fears were making things worse. So he did what he would have done if he hadn't been afraid. He changed direction and started running down the dark hallway, smiling. Ra didn't understand him yet, but he discovered what was feeding his soul. To his surprise, Ra was having more and more fun. Why am I having so much fun? He asked himself. I haven't got any cheese and I don't know where I'm going. Soon after, he knew why he felt good. He stopped to write again on a wall, when you overcome your fear, you feel free. I realized that he had been held captive by his own fear. Moving in a new direction had set him free. Now he felt the gentle breeze blowing through that part of the labyrinth and refreshing him. He took a deep breath and felt energized. Once his fear was over, he took more pleasure than ever. He had almost forgotten how much fun looking for cheese was. Then he did better. He built a mental image. He saw himself sitting very distinctly in the middle of a mountain of all his favorite cheeses, from cheddar to brie. He ate them and enjoyed what he saw. The more clearly he represented the image of the new cheese, the more real it became and the more he felt he was going to find. He wrote, "Imagining myself enjoying new cheese that I haven't found yet leads me to it. Why didn't I do this before?" Ha wondered. Then he ran with more strength and agility. Shortly after, he spotted a cheese station and was excited to find small pieces of new cheese near the entrance. He tasted them and found them delicious. He ate almost everything he could find, putting some in his pocket for later and maybe sharing with Ha. He was beginning to regain his strength. Very optimistic, he walked into a cheese station. He realized that if he had moved sooner, he would most likely have found plenty of new cheese here. Had decided to return to his space to see if Ha was ready to join him. Wall. The sooner you let go of the old cheese, the sooner you find the new. After a while, Ha found the cheese station this Hum. He offered him pieces of new cheese, but Hum rejected them although he appreciated his friend's gesture. He said, "I don't want a new cheese. It's not the one I'm used to." Ha simply shook his head in disappointment and reluctantly walked away on his own. He missed his friend, but he liked what he was discovering. Even before he had found the large amount of new cheese he was hoping for, he knew what he was enjoying wasn't just having cheese. He was happy to no longer be guided by his fear. He loved what he was doing now. You should know, Ha no longer felt as weak as when he was in the cheese station without cheese. Taking control of his fear and his reorientation nourished him and gave him strength. He said it was just a matter of time. In fact, he felt he had already found what he was looking for. They smiled, realizing it's safer to search the maze than to stay somewhere without cheese. Ha thought once again, that what we are afraid of is never as bad as we imagine. He had been so dreaded that he would never find any new cheese that he didn't even want to start looking for it. But ever since he left, he had been finding enough cheese in the corridors to keep him in shape. He was now looking forward to finding more. Just looking at the future became exciting. His old system of thought was clouded by his worries and fears, thinking more about what could go wrong than what could go right. But that hadn't existed since he left the cheese station without cheese. He used to believe that the cheese was never moved and that the change was bad. Now he realized that change was happening all the time and spontaneously, whether you expected it or not. When he realized he had changed his beliefs, he stopped to write on the wall. Old beliefs don't lead you to new cheese. Ha hadn't found any cheese yet, but as he ran through the maze he was thinking about what he had already learned. Ha had understood that his new beliefs led to new behaviors. He had behaved differently since he had left the cheeseless station. When you change what you believe in, you also change how you act. We can think that a change will hurt and resist it. Or we can think that finding new cheese will help to manage the change. One has a choice of beliefs. He wrote on the wall. As soon as you see that you can find and enjoy new cheese, you change course. Ha knew he would have been in better shape if he had accepted the change much sooner and left cheese station C sooner. He would have felt stronger in body and mind. I'll probably have found some cheese by now, rather than wasting time denying the reality of change. Remotivated, he decided to explore new parts of the labyrinth. He found small pieces of cheese from time to time and regained strength and confidence. Remembering where he came from, Ha was glad he had written on the walls in many places. He just hoped he was heading in the right direction. Ha then wrote what he had pondered. Now Ha had put aside the past and adapted to the future. He crossed the labyrinth with more strength and speed. And soon after, it happened. When he seemed to have spent his whole life in the labyrinth, or at least a large part of it, his journey came to a quick and happy end. Ha had found new cheese at Station Fromagene. Upon entering, Was flabbergasted by the largest quantity of cheese he had ever seen. He did not recognize all the varieties, as some were new. Then he wondered for a moment if his vision was a figment of his imagination, until he saw his old friend Sniff at Woof. Sniff greeted her with a nod and Woof waved his paw. Their big bellies showed that they were killers for a moment. Ha greeted them quickly and soon bit into each of his favorite cheeses. He took off his shoes and his jogging pants and folded them carefully nearby, in case he needed them again. Then he jumped into the new cheese. Long live the change. As he savored the new cheese, Ha reflected on what he had learned. When he was afraid to change, he imagined that the old cheese was still there. So what had made him change? Was it the fear of starving? Well, that had helped. Then he smiled, realizing that he had started to change as soon as he was laughing at himself and what he was doing wrong. He understood that the quickest way to change is to laugh at his own madness. Only then can he let go and evolve quickly. He had also learned from the behavior of his buddies, Sniff and Woof. They lived simply. They didn't overanalyze or overcomplicate things. Then Ha, with his marvelous brain, did what he was smarter than a mouse for. He reflects on past mistakes and plans his future accordingly. It is possible to learn how to manage change. Keep in mind the need to simplify things, to remain flexible and to move quickly. There is no need to complicate the situation, nor to get lost in beliefs filled with fears. We can sometimes notice the small changes and better prepare ourselves for the big change that could occur. He had to adapt more quickly because otherwise he wouldn't adapt at all. Perhaps more importantly, he understood that there was always new cheese out there whether we recognized it or not. We must partly listen to fear, because it protects against real dangers. But most fears are irrational and prevent us from changing when we need to. Even though Han didn't like it lasting too long, the change had turned out to be a blessing because he had led to finding a better cheese. He had even found a better part of himself. Then he thought of his friend Hum. Had he decided to let go and move? Had he entered the labyrinth? Had he discovered what could make your life better? Ha plans to come back for Hum at Cheese Station C, assuming he can find his way home. He thought he could show him how to get out of it. But he realized that he had already tried to get his friend to react. Hum had to find his own path, outside his comfort zone and beyond his fears. No one could do it for him, nor convince him. Ha had left a trail and Hum could find his way. All he had to do was read the writings on the walls. He made the point and wrote a summary of what he had learned on the largest wall in Station Fromage, and then he drew a large piece of cheese around the words thus formulated and smiled at what he had learned. Change happens. They move the cheese all the time. Anticipate change. Get ready for the cheese to move. Follow the change. Smell the cheese often to detect when it is getting old. Adapt quickly to change. The sooner you give up old cheese, the sooner you will find new cheese. Exchange. Move with the cheese, enjoy the change. Savor the adventure and taste the new cheese. Be ready to change quickly and enjoy it again. They move the cheese without cease. Ha realized how far he had come since leaving him at Cheese Station C, but he knew how easy it was to let go when you felt too comfortable. Every day, he inspected the cheese station and to check the stock of cheese. He would do everything he could not to be surprised by an unexpected change. Even though Ha still had plenty of cheese on hand, he often went out into the maze and explored new areas to take in what was going on around him. He had learned that it was safer to be aware of the real choices than to isolate himself in his comfort zone. Then, Ha heard what he thought was a sound of movement in the maze. As the sound grew louder, he realized that someone was coming. Could Hum be coming? Did he get away with it? Ha said a little prayer and hoped, as so many times before, that maybe, finally, his friend had been able. Move with the cheese and enjoy it. A discussion, a little later, the same day. Michael finishes telling the story and looks around the room. His old classmates smile at him. Several thanked him, They learned a good lesson from this story. Nathan then asks the group, how about meeting again and discussing it? Most therefore accept. They agree to meet after dinner for a drink. When evening comes, they meet in the hotel lounge and start joking about their search for cheese and their visit to the Renth. Then Angela, in a playful mood, asks, so, who were you in the story? Sniff, woof, humuha? Carlos replies, well, I was asking myself the question this afternoon. I remember very well that once, before having this lucrative business in the sport, I helped with difficulty a change. I wasn't sniffing around to scan the beginnings. And I certainly wasn't woof either. I wasn't immediately jumping into the action. I was more like wanting to stay on familiar ground. In truth, I didn't want to deal with a change. Michael, who hasn't had much time to spend since his school years with his great friend Carlos, asks, what happened, buddy? An unexpected job change, answers Carlos. You were fired? Exclaims Michael. Well, let's just say I didn't want to go looking for new cheese. I thought change couldn't happen in my life. So at the time, I was upset about it. Some former classmates, quiet at first, feel more at ease and start speaking up, including Frank, a military man. Called me from a friend of mine. His unit was closing, but he was denying it. His team was being transferred. We all tried to persuade him of the many opportunities his company offered to those who were flexible, but he didn't imagine he would have to change. He was on his own when his unit closed. I didn't think that would happen either, but my cheese has been moved more than once, says Jessica. Several members of the band were walking, except Nathan. Maybe that's the whole point, he says. Change is happening to all of us. I wish my family had known about this cheese story sooner, he adds. This surprises many of the guests. For them, Nathana gives her the chance to have a job to count on, year after year. What happened? Asks Jessica. Our chain of small stores suddenly became obsolete when a hypermarket with its wide selection and low prices moved to town? We just couldn't compete. I now realize that instead of being like Sniff It Woof, we were like Hum. Laura, now an accomplished businesswoman, has listened but spoken very little so far. I was thinking about the story this afternoon. I was wondering how to be more like what I had done wrong and why laugh at myself, change and do better. I'd be curious to know how many of you dread change? No one answers, so she suggests, why don't you raise your hand? Only one hand is raised. Well, it looks like we only have one honest person in the group, she said. Maybe you'll be more comfortable with this question. How many think the others are afraid of change? Everyone raises their hand. And everyone laughs. What does this tell us? Letany, replies Nathan. Sometimes we are not even aware of being afraid, admits Michael. This was my case. Hearing the story the first time, I liked the question, what would you do if you weren't afraid? Then Jessica adds, well, what I've learned is that the change will happen, whether I'm afraid of it or not, whether I like it or not. I remember several years ago our company sold encyclopedias in several volumes. Someone tried to tell us that we should put our documents on diskette and reduce the selling price. Why? Asks Nathan. Because we believe in and that the strength of our company was the size of our door-to-door sales team. Their motivation depended on the important commissions allowed by the high price of our product. It was your cheese, said Nathan. Yes. And we clung to it? When I think about what happened to us, I realize that the cheese wasn't just bitten. It has a life of its own that eventually runs out. Anyway, we haven't changed, unlike a competitor, and our sales have dropped drastically. We've been through a tough time. Now another big technological change is happening in our industry and no one in the company seems to care. It doesn't bode well. It's time for the labyrinth, exclaims Carlos. Everyone is laughing, even Jessica. Carlos turns around and says, "It's a good sign that you can laugh at yourself." "That's what history taught me," Frank replies. "I tend to take myself too seriously." I noticed how much Hot changed when he finally managed to make fun of him and what he was doing. No wonder he was called Ha. Then Angela asks, "Do you think Hum has changed and found the new cheese?" "I think so," said Elaine. "I don't think so," Corey says. "Some people never change and they pay the price. I see people like Hum in my medical center. They victimize when they get up and blame others. This makes them more bitter than those who have let go and move on." Then Nathan said quietly, as if talking to himself, "I guess the question is, what do we let go of and where do we go?" Everybody was a moment. "I must admit," Nathan continues, "that I have seen what is happening in other parts of our country, but I was hoping that it would not affect us." "What do you want to study?" asks Frank. "I can't help wondering where we would be today if we had sold our old stores to build a big, modern one that rivaled the best," Nathan replies. "Maybe that's what Hum meant when he wrote on the wall, 'Enjoy the adventure and travel with the cheese,'" Laura continues. "I don't think some things should change," replies Frank. "For example, I want to preserve my core values." "Well, Michael, that was a nice little story," says Richard, the skeptic of the class, "but how did you actually apply it in your business?" The group doesn't know it yet, but Richard is going through some changes himself. Recently separated from his wife, he is now trying to reconcile his career with the education of his teenage children. Michael responds, "You know, I thought my job was just to deal with day-to-day problems, as they arose, when it was really about planning for the future and seeing which way we were going. However, after hearing the story 'Who Pricked My Cheese?' and as I evolved, I realized that my job was to imagine the new cheese. And to do so with such clarity and realism that my colleagues and I love at this change and the collective success." "That's interesting," says Angela. "Running through the maze then became less scary and more enjoyable. And it finally got better." Richard, who had frowned during the discussion, said, "My superior warned me that our company had to change. I think she wanted to tell me that it was me who had to change, but I didn't want to hear it. I might be able to use it at home. My kids seem to think that nothing should ever change in their lives. This idea makes them angry. I guess they're afraid of the future." The group was silent while several thought about their own family life. "Well," said Elaine, "we talked a lot about work, but when I was listening to the story, I was thinking about my personal life." Corey nods laughingly, "Me too. I probably need to end a bad relationship." Angela replied, "Or maybe the old cheese is just old behavior. What really needs to be let go is our behavior causing our bad relationships. And then moving on to a better way of thinking and acting." "Ouch," responds Corey, "good point. The new cheese is a new relationship with the same person." "I'm starting to think there's more to this story than I thought," said Richard. "I like the idea of abandoning an old behavior rather than a relationship. Instead of changing jobs, maybe I should have been one of those helping my business grow. I probably would have gotten a better job than the current one." Then, Becky, who lives in another town but came back for the meeting, said, "Listening to the story and all your comments, I laugh at myself. For a long time I looked like Hum, hesitant and afraid of change. I didn't know that so many people were in my situation. Thinking about it, I realized that the change can really lead to a new, much better place, even though I initially feared the impasse. I remember when our son was a sophomore in high school. Eventually, he fell in love, took up skiing and skied on his college team. He now lives happily in Colorado." To Jessica replicate, "I am going home to tell this story. I will ask my children who they think I am, sniff, woof, hum-oo-ha, and who they think I am. Could be the new cheese." "What a good idea," declares Richard. Then Frank comments, I think I'm going to imitate me moving around with the cheese and enjoying it. And I'm going to tell this story to all my friends who are worried about leaving the army and tell them what the change means to them. Well, said Michael, that's how we came out of the crisis. We had a good discussion about how rich this cheesy story was and how to apply it to our own situation. It's good because it's a fun way to illustrate change management. How so? Asks Nathan. Well, the higher we got in the hierarchy, the less powerful people felt. They naturally dreaded the impact of change imposed from above. So they resisted the change. In short, an imposed change causes an opposite change. I wish I had heard this cheese story sooner, adds Michael. Why? Asks Carlos. Because before we could react to the change, our business had already collapsed so much that we had to let people go, including good friends. We all had a hard time with it. Those who had to go looking for a new job said it was difficult at first, but remembering the history made them feel better. What helped them the most? Asks Angela. Michael responds. After they got over their fear, they said, they realized with pleasure that there was new cheese there, just waiting to be found. Representing the image of the new cheese relieved them, so they were more successful in their job interviews. Several got better jobs. How did the people who remained in the company react? Asks Laura. Well, Michael replies, instead of complaining about the changes that were happening, they said, let's travel with our cheese. Let's look for the new one. They saved a lot of time and felt less stressed. Shortly after, people who had resisted saw the benefit of adapting. They were even helped to make changes. Why do you think it happened that way? Said Corey. I think that pressure from colleagues in a company plays a big role. What happens in the organizations you have worked in when a change is announced by management? Do most think the change is a good idea or a bad idea? Bad idea, Frank replies. Yes, agrees Michael. Why? Carlos says. Because people want things to stay the same and think the change will be bad for them. When a smart person says change is a bad idea, others follow. Yes, even if they are not convinced, says Michael, they want to look smart too. This is the kind of pressure exerted by colleagues who resist change in any organization. Becky adds, in families, the same thing can happen between parents and children. So how did the situation change after employees heard the cheese story? Michael simply says, they changed because nobody wanted to look like him. Everyone laughs including Nathan, who says, that's a good point. None of my family would want to look like him. They might even change their behavior. Why didn't you tell us that story at our last meeting? It could have changed so many things. Michael shares one final thought. When we saw how well it worked for us, we passed the story on to our privileged partners whose organizations also needed to undergo a change. We suggested that we could be their new cheese, the best people to prosper with. This gives Jessica several ideas and reminds her to make a few early morning prospecting calls. She looks at her watch and says, well, it's time for me to leave this cheese station and find a new cheese. The group laughs and says goodbye. Many would like to continue but have to leave. They thank Michael again. This one answers. I'm very glad you found the story so useful and I hope you'll have the opportunity to share it with others soon. Should I read more books? If yes, 1. Like this video. 2. Share this video. 3. Comment the title of the next book you want. Thank you for your watching. I see you in the next video.